What's up, everybody? This is Brian here, and we're going to be talking about music today. We're going to be doing a countdown of the top 10 most recognizable singers. Now, that doesn't necessarily preclude people who had limited ability but made up for it with their character. That doesn't really count them out of this list, so to speak. This isn't just a pure range list. I mean, otherwise, it would be made up of people like Freddie Mercury and Whitney Houston, and not that they're not deserving and amazing singers, but this list, while it has some of those type of singers on it, it's not just them. It's also made up of people who had really unique voices that you truly couldn't forget, and that's what's important here. We're talking about recognizable, unique types of singers here, and so this is a top 10 in no particular order of that. So let's get on to it. All right. Michael Jackson is number one. I think the range and the variety in his songs from the Jackson 5 all the way to when he was an adult, they show things in pop and hard rock. I think almost going a little bit onto the disco genre in songs like when he was, the early 80s when he was just starting to go solo and he got his curly hair and his, songs like Thriller and Billie Jean, but kind of that transitional period when he was a young man in his early 20s and he was uh, just getting out of the Jackson 5 and getting into his own career before a lot of the tumult came in the media. But yeah, you can hear so much. He had equal talent to any amount of tumult he had in his personal life. You can really always spot a Michael Jackson song, and I think his additions to music as a whole always make him recognizable. He's truly one of the great characters in American history, especially of the 20th century. And he added those little vocal mannerisms as almost a tradition in music. Those little things like the and the little grunts or growls that he added. You don't hear that in music. At least I don't when I listen to it. You don't hear that stuff in music when you listen prior to Michael Jackson. Um, and I think that any time that you do after him, it's people trying to copy him, frankly. And frankly, he's one of the best selling artists of all time in any genre. And so I don't think you could find someone who isn't instantly familiar with Michael Jackson's voice. So I think he belongs on the top 10 most recognizable voices countdown. Another way less famous and way more underrated artist that I'm going to put at number two on this list is going back in time considerably towards around the World War II period in the 20th century. We're putting Sister Rosetta Tharpe at number two on here. Her voice is equally powerful to a lot of these rock singers that we're covering on here, and she's kind of almost like a female Howlin' Wolf if you've ever heard him. Um, Her voice was considerably different though in terms of what she produced than those people who sang those harder edge, more sexually charged songs. She really had a strength and a growl to her voice, though. She was a gospel vocalist and was actually the first one to cross over and chart in her genre. So she was a real barrier breaker and a door opener. I love the depth of her voice, and you can really hear the unmitigated passion towards God. It was a real revelation for me when I heard her voice and when I heard her unleash that lion that she really had in her windpipes. For the first time, I really wanted to get a CD of her the second time I heard that. Or, sorry, the second I heard that, not the second time I heard that. That wouldn't make much sense. Anyways, but socially, she was also a barrier breaker in that she was an African American female musician that charted in the 1940s. This is well before African American people could even sit at the front of a bus. So I mean, keep in mind what she's doing here. She couldn't do that either, but she was. Sorry, I have a little bit of jaw myoclonus because of my epilepsy. But yeah, she was able to chart when she still couldn't do things like that. So she's a real door opener, I think. And she was also a door opener for future rock musicians of all skin colors and future singers too, with her overdriven Gibson SG and her awesome playing. I can see Little Richard and I can see Chuck Berry. In the future when I look into her eyes as she tears into the solos of songs like This Train, you know. I also hear the love of God in her voice, and I don't hear any fear of the barriers of the time, such as the racism and the segregated audiences. And she played before those audiences and in what's the word I'm looking for? Um, she played before mixed audiences and with mixed bands, so that's pretty impressive for the time period. She was kind of like the Jackie Robinson of music in a way. Uh, and as I said, this is before desegregation and during World War II largely. So she really opened doors racially and gender wise. Her voice hits like a choir when you hear it. By the way, uh, stomping, you know. Number three on here is going to be moving forward a little bit towards the 70s and 80s, and well, he's not dead or anything, but that's the prime of his career, I think. Rod Stewart, I think his gruff, warm, and loving vocals they carry the emotion of his songs, no matter if it's one of those heartbreaker songs like those Since My Baby Left Me type songs or whatever the message of his music was. Um, I think that he may not have had the most range, but this isn't a list of the best pure vocalists. I think uh, in terms of most recognizable, I could surely pick his distinct, almost rusty and gritty voice out of a lineup from a mile away. Also, my favorite CD personally is a Rod Stewart CD. So, for what that's worth, just a little fact there. Yeah, I think Rod Stewart certainly has one of the most recognizable voices, and certainly from his era. Number four is going to be Chris Cornell. Chris Cornell had the best pure voice, including range, I think, of his generation, and also his genre, especially for a male singer. Many singers from the grunge and the alternative rock era and the punk rock era, they had kind of garage band level vocals, and they just shredded their vocal cords likewise. And I think that everyone kind of sounded like Nirvana, like they were ripping off Nirvana in the 90s. I'm not accusing anyone of copying, and because some of those bands were before Nirvana, so it may have been the other way around. And I'm not saying anything against Nirvana because they're one of my favorite bands actually. So I love grunge, but I'm just saying that he was one of the most unique singers of that whole era of people. I mean, look at who else from that period in the early '90s, especially. Who else hit notes in their singing, uh, like in songs such as "Rusty Cage," "Outshined," or "Fell on Black Days," or um, you know, Chris Cornell. He'll always be missed. I think that he made Soundgarden um, with his unique and amazingly versatile voice. The man was a true virtuoso, and I think he was a really skilled musician in a decade where volume was the dominating factor. So Soundgarden had a lot of other songs besides those ones I just mentioned. So check them out and check out other things like Audio Slave that Chris Cornell was a part of. Um, yeah, real loss in that one. Shame. Uh, Number five is going to be Laura Nero. Um, she was an amazing singer, I think. Uh, I wouldn't put her on here, obviously, if I didn't think so, but still, um, the combined strength and depth of her voice from it kind of it carried over like the R&B singers like Aretha Franklin almost with the higher and slightly more feminine vocals of kind of those 60s era folk singers like Joan Baez or Joni Mitchell. She sounds uniquely different from any of those people, and you can form your own opinion of each one as you like. But Laura Nyro, I think that she carried the strength in her voice from like soul music and she could also hit the higher notes. She wasn't kind of in like a Johnny Cash type baritone range, but she kind of she was in between almost in the genres. I think that Laura Nero had really one of the most soulful voices ever. And if you're already familiar with her most, uh, I guess you'd say in terms of sales, her most successful work that she released in the late 60s and 70s. If you're familiar with that stuff, and if you're not, then check it out. And sorry, if you are familiar with that stuff, though, try the posthumously released album uh, from 2001 called Angel in the Dark. There's a lot of really beautiful songs on there. And I think that Laura Nero, she was also an underrated songwriter, of course. A lot of other people had hits with things that she wrote, so she was one of those artists that kind of, sorry, problems with the voice here. She was one of those people that wrote songs and other people got credit for them. Yeah, so she's underrated in my opinion. She was really unforgettable. I think that the many genres she touches on, like R&B, soul, rock, and even into pop and disco in her career, she had that strength in her voice without necessarily being heavy or low. She could still hit higher notes, and she wasn't stuck down there where she sounded kind of manly or something, you know. Uh, the nearest comparison I could really think of is someone like Janis Joplin, really, or maybe Patsy Cline, but I think she really has her own unique voice. But still, I think Laura Nero is an underrated female musician and a really recognizable voice because she had she was kind of in between. She was one of those people that could do it all. She didn't have like a glassy or piercing voice, um, but she wasn't kind of stuck down in the basement in terms of her range. Um, anyways, yeah, number six on here is going to be back in history a little bit towards the 1920s, 30s through the 50s. She actually had a very long career, actually. Billie Holiday. I think that she made up for any lack of range or technical abilities with her character and singing mannerisms and the warmth in her vocals, you know? She had what you'd call intangibles in her voice, the same way that Michael Jackson had a unique vocalization in many of his songs, you know? Um, she what am I trying to say? She struggled for much of her life with alcoholism, which affected why she passed when she was pretty young in 1959, and it also affected her voice in her later in life. You know, I think that she was really the first female artist to have success on the charts and in her career in general with a little bit more of a gruff voice, with a little bit more growl or grit, or even if you want to say chest hair on her voice. It's great. That's a great barrier breaker because this was around a time when largely, there were a lot of gender barriers and a lot of the recording technology too was all of it made the people in general sound sped up, and especially the women I've heard in jazz music, they sound kind of like they're pinching their nose and like they're singing on helium. They sound kind of like Bob Dylan on helium. So the fact that she could have a more full voice um, kind of accounted for any of the soulfulness accounted for any of the range. You know, it shows you that some depth and soul can account for range when you're not like a young Ella Fitzgerald in terms of your voice. Um, anyways, yeah. So I think that she really was a barrier breaker, and it's sad that she is one of those people who is destroyed by drugs and alcohol. Um, yeah. Let's go into Louis Armstrong. Several times in this video, I've touched on the word gritty. Louis Armstrong, I think his picture would be in the dictionary next to the word gritty. Um, he was also one of those people who was remembered as like the bar, like the line in the sand, like person who is the example they always bring up, kind of like Hendrix on guitar, or like Art Tatum on piano. He's like that on trumpet, you know. So he wasn't just a memorable singer, but he was also a bar setter on his instrument, which is impressive. I picked Louis Armstrong though because I think nobody else is close in sound at all to his voice, and he's also so very recognizable and meaningful. Also, as a personal thing, I also kind of always, because my grandparents were in a jazz band. I remember them playing a lot of the songs that he played. Louis Armstrong, I think, is like the vocal equivalent of being hugged by a grizzly bear in a good way. I think Winnie the Pooh more than being eviscerated and eaten. The rich, deep, growling voice that he has, I think, sets him apart as a figure in American music history. He's one of those people whose photo would be on a timeline if you were to make one of true innovators and people who defined their time period. His time period was most of the 20th century, though, since he was born, I think, in like 1901, and he lived, I think, well, I think he lived into his 90s, didn't he? Um, yeah, I don't know. I have no internet, so I can't look that up. Um, anyways, yeah, let's go on to number eight. Sorry for rambling. Number eight is Fats Waller, the premier stride pianist of the 20s and the 30s. Often overlooked though is his great jazz voice. If you've ever seen a video of Fats Waller, he has kind of this he has like a caterpillar unibrow that's always moving up and down, and his voice is kind of it's gritty and it's also I think it's kind of like the vocalization form of his eyebrow, singular singular form. I think his coarse voice was the perfect accompaniment to his energetic playing, though. I watched a video of him playing Honeysuckle Rose, and his voice was unforgettable. It embodies the roaring 20s perfectly, and the 30s too. Um, Let me just double check this. I'm just trying to make sure my camera timer doesn't run up. Number nine on here is going to be Jim Morrison. His smooth baritone vocals are really unique, and I can't think of any time when I have confused a Doors song with any other band. Have you ever like gone to the radio and been like, "Oh, break on through to the other side"? I'm really glad the Beatles wrote that one, or something like that. I mean, can you think of a time when you've said, "Oh, Crystal Ship" or "Break on through to the other side"? What a great Blue Oyster Cult song. I mean, they're really quintessential, I think. He's a quintessential rock voice and frontman, that low and creeping influence of fear and heaviness into the listener. I think it inflicts, along with the instruments at the beginning of songs like that song where it starts with the rain. I'm not thinking of the name for some reason. Um, yeah, but that song where it starts out with the heavy instruments and the music, it's able to he's able to reach all the way up to like that Little Richard range and do the rock and roll screech like Little Richard or the Sonics or heavy metal musicians from the 80s. At the same time, I think he can convey lust or love, whatever he's really looking for. He's really a five-tool player vocally. I know that the Doors and Jim Morrison didn't have a very long career, but he's still one of the foundational musicians in rock and roll. And plus, he's really captivating and unforgettable. Perhaps the best words would be haunting and mystifying. With his voice, it kind of lingers like a fog before the crescendo kind of goes up in your face. Anyways, uh, checking on this. Here, I'm going to do a part two. Just one second.